Hello, everyone. This is Dory Clark, and we're here with our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And our guest this week is author Michael Bach. Michael is the author of his most recent book is called Alphabet Soup. He's also the author of a book called Birds of All Feathers. I love these titles. These are fantastic. And he is based in Canada. He's an expert in diversity issues. Michael, it's wonderful to have you here.
It's great to be here, Dory. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. So my first question, I'm always curious about this because, so often in the United States, of course, we're, massively solipsistic. And so much of the discussion about diversity, I think sort of assumes that the American concept of diversity is somehow universal. But I know that even in Canada, which is not that far away, it looks very different. The fault lines are different. The way that people think about things is different. I would actually just be curious right off the bat, as a Canadian diversity expert, how do you see similarities or differences? How do you sort of think about these things?
It's a great question because a lot of people will look at Canada and the United States and see a great deal of similarity. So, and they will essentially think of us like very close cousins. And for all intents and purposes, we are. But there are also some big differences to our countries, particularly how we approach the diversity conversation. The conversation around race and ethnicity, as an example, we don't have large populations of Black or Hispanic residents of this country. Our largest two ethnic groups outside of Caucasian people are South Asian and Southeast Asian, specifically India and China. So we see a very different landscape, and we're also dealing with different issues. We didn't have slavery, at least not to the extent that the United States did. We've done a lot more work with our indigenous peoples or Native Americans. We have been in some ways more progressive as it relates to the LGBTQIA plus population. In some ways, not so much, but there are a lot of similarities. I think moreover, it's how we talk about things. We don't have the same legislations. We don't have the same motivations. But ultimately, there are a lot of similarities, and the differences are more subtle. It's more nuanced than, say, the difference between diversity in the United States and the difference between and diversity in, say, South Africa.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it's just, for me, such a valuable reminder because we often get so locked into our views of, this is what diversity is, or this is what the discussion is. And you realize that in different countries or different cultural contexts, you're talking about radically different things. So I think that's interesting. Another thing that I noticed also, Michael, just in terms of language and the power of language, in the US, typically what you hear, every few years, the language somehow gets rebranded somehow by a magic consensus. Nowadays, it seems to be DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not sure if this is just you or if this is like in Canada in general, but on your website and materials, you talk about idea. Mm-hmm. I'm like, what's idea? That's amazing. But it is apparently inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. So talk to me about that. Like, is that a common thing? And how do you think about how language shapes the discourse around diversity issues?
Yeah, so it's not just me. I'm not the only person to use idea. I decided to start using idea because I'm a person who lives with a disability or diverse ability. And, I've been working in this field for nearly 20 years, and I consistently see the accessibility piece of this conversation kind of fall off a table somewhere. It's an afterthought. I worked for an employer once who shall remain nameless to protect the guilty, who moved into a new office. And I walked in the door and I said, there are no assistive devices on any of the doors. And they had to go back and retrofit the entire building. And this was an organization that was very much proactive in their work on diversity and inclusion, but accessibility is often left off the table. So that's why I really wanted to put it in the initialism or acronym that I use to say it's just as important as the diversity, inclusion, and equity piece. Also, accessibility is not just about physical access. It's about how people access the organization in any way, such as language, as an example. I live in a country, at least today, that has 2 official languages, but also many, many indigenous languages. We've also got languages from many other countries that are spoken here. Um, and then you look at the United States, unofficially, you have Spanish as a second language, whether you want to admit that or not. And so how do people access your organization through a language perspective? So that's why I started to use IDEA. There are other versions of this acronym. You'll sometimes hear JEDI, JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity. I know, right? And it comes with a lightsaber for obvious reasons. Sometimes you'll hear the B, so DEIB, which stands for belonging. Oh, there are so many things about these acronyms that I could talk about. I think it is the evolution of language. I think when I started in this field so long ago, it was diversity and inclusion. First, it was just diversity, and then we added inclusion because we needed to start talking about the including of the diversity. And then equity is relatively speaking, has crept into the title recently. And I think it's important because we have to understand that we're not all starting from the same place. I think the language will continue to evolve. My only caveat to this, the asterisk beside this conversation, is I worry that we spend too much time focused on what acronym we're using, what words we're using, and not focused enough on the change and focused on working towards addressing the systemic barriers that we see in society. So, I think the words are really important until they're not.
You raise an excellent point. We're here with Michael Bach. He is a diversity expert. He's the author of a couple of books. His most recent one is called Alphabet Soup. We're going to turn to that in a minute. This is Dory Clark with our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. So, just getting over a cold here. So Michael, you raise a really interesting point about language, about the fact that it can sometimes become a bit of a rabbit hole. So, useful, but not if we get too obsessed with it, perhaps. So I love it with your kind of, I assume, kind of tongue-in-cheek title here of your book. It's Alphabet Soup, the essential guide to LGBTQ 2+. I'm not even sure the right way to say that. It's sort of like Elon Musk's son's name, inclusion at work. So I know that oftentimes one of the things that I think is both sweet and tragic at the same time is when I see very, very well-meaning straight people attempting to remember the letters and try to get them right and get them in the right place. And it seems very confusing. So talk to me about this. Obviously, your book is about a whole web of things, not just the particulars of language, but let's use that as a starting point. How should people even be talking about the LGBT, asterisk plus exponential sign community? And what do we do with this? How do we make it so that people aren't scared in the process of saying the wrong thing?
Oh my gosh, how long do we have for this podcast? This is, some of the biggest issue that I see with people, particularly who are straight and cisgender, who are just terrified of the initialism and what the letters stand for and which do I use and which order. Like, people get freaked out, and we keep changing it to make it matters worse. When I came out of the closet just before Confederation, it was L and G, and that was it. And then it became LGB, then LGBT. In Canada, we use 2S, LGBTQI+. The 2S, or 2, stands for Two-Spirit, which is a person who is Native Canadian, Indigenous, who also identifies as LGBTQIA. The I is a recent addition to the initialism. Sometimes you'll see an A in it. In the United States, you use LGBTQIA+. In the media, you use LGBTQ+. I will tell you that none of them are wrong. Everyone just needs to take a breath and relax. None of these initialisms are wrong. There's 2 things I will say. One, throw a plus sign on there or an asterisk on there. The intention of that plus sign or asterisk at the end is to say, we're going to use these letters, but there's a whole lot more. And for every person in the community that you'll ask, you'll get a different version of the initialism. And some are very, very short and some are ridiculously long. So if you want to use LGBT, great. If you want to use LGBTQ, totally fine. Just add the plus or the asterisk at the end. The other thing I'll say is just be respectful in how you use the language. When I published my book, Alphabet Soup, and the second part of the title is The Essential Guide to LGBTQ2 plus Inclusion. When I published it in March of 2022, that was the initialism that was being used by the Canadian federal government. They've changed. My book is now a collector's item because they've moved on to a different initialism. It'll change. It's going to change in the next 20 minutes. Just be respectful in what language you're using. And if you're unsure, ask. If you're not sure what the letter stands for, Google it. Educate yourself, but just do it in a respectful manner so that you are not inadvertently offending someone. Again, don't get hung up on the language. It's not what the words are, it's how you're using the words that is far more important.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. We're here with Michael Bach. He is the author of the new book, Alphabet Soup. This is Dory Clark with Better, our Newsweek weekly interview show. I remember, I wish I could remember who this person was, but there was an interview I read with some trans person who was saying, I accept all pronouns as long as they're used respectfully. And I thought, well,
Yes,
that's a nice answer.
that's great.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Michael, I'm curious. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your origin story. I mean, I know you had a stint, working in high levels in sort of the corporate sphere. So you were
Yep.
right in the thick of it. But how did you come to do diversity work?
Yeah, so the Reader's Digest version of this story is that I came out as gay in 1987, and I, for a variety of reasons, mostly my parents, became involved quite actively in the community in working toward LGBTQIA plus inclusion. But that wasn't a job that I was going to get paid for. That wasn't or at least not what I wanted to make because I'm a capitalist swine. And so I worked in IT primarily. It was, the 90s. It was the beginning of what we now know to be an incredible industry. And so I spent most of my career in IT. And then in 2005, I was working for KPMG in the IT consulting practice. And I, along with a group of people, started Pride at KPMG, which was the employee resource group for the LGBT population and their allies. And long story short, that got me the attention of the CEO and the chief HR officer. And I went to them and said, if we're serious about diversity, we need full-time resources. And I want that job. And they sent me away to write a business case on the creation of a role. And they gave me the job. And that was 2005. And I've been in the field ever since. And frankly, I didn't know what I was doing. I was completely flying by the seat of my pants. But when I started in this field, there was probably 50 people in the profession that had diversity in their title. I went on to be lead diversity for KPMG's operations in Canada. And then I was also the deputy chief diversity officer for KPMG globally. So I worked in 152 countries, technically, around the world, helping KPMG's operations sort of figure out what the diversity meant to their country, including in the US. And then in 2012, I started something called the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. And I became the CEO of that organization in 2013. And then in just last year, in November of last year, I decided I wanted a bit of a slower life. And so I now am out on my own, just doing speaking gigs and writing books.
I love it. It's a good arc. Michael Bach, author of Alphabet Soup and Birds of All Feathers. So Michael, one of the things that we do every week with the show Better is we have our guest nominate someone who they believe exemplifies the principles of positively advancing diversity and inclusion issues, or shall we say, idea issues: inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. You have nominated Zora Halani. Can you talk a little bit about Zora and why
Oh,
they are your nominee?
absolutely. I am a huge Zora Halani fan, stan, as the kids say, although I'm still not clear what that means. Zora and I met a number of years ago, probably 10 plus years ago, when she was working for an oil and gas company in a diversity role. And we really clicked. It was really immediately clear to me that Zora was one of those people that was not just a doer. She was somebody that got it. She was somebody that had vision. And we continued to work together on a variety of projects. She would have me in as a speaker. I did different work for her um, through the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and its consulting arm, CCDI Consulting. And then she went on to, she now works for a company called BCI, which is British Columbia Investments. And she leads diversity for BCI. And she's just somebody who, you know, she's gone way past the performative of work in idea. Like, she's not terribly concerned about putting on a potluck lunch. You know, she's looking at the pipeline of talent for leadership, and what does succession planning look like through a diversity lens, and how inclusive is the organization at all levels. And like, she just is somebody who gets the full picture of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. I swear, idea is going to catch on. She's really just one of those unique people in this space.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael Bach. He is our guest this week. He's the author of Birds of Feathers and Alphabet Soup. So, going back to your current book, Michael, a lot of people might say in the United States, perhaps especially in Canada, that this is not true everywhere. But if we're talking certainly about larger corporations, we should be feeling pretty good, right? If you're an LGBT person, you can get married. You've got protections in terms of being able to not be fired from your job because you are LGBT. Why did you feel compelled to write a book about this now? And what do you feel like are the issues that people are facing? What might the average person be missing in this equation?
Yeah, so let's start with the first question. I wrote the book because, having been out working in this space for 30 plus years, I'm just going to pull back the skin on my eyes. Um, I'm still getting asked the same questions. Yes, we've made a lot of progress, but there are still people that don't understand, like, the fundamental differences of the difference between sexuality and gender, as an example. And I think we don't do ourselves a lot of justice, because we say LGBT and we don't then explain that there's two things in there. The L, the G, and the B are exclusively sexual orientations. The T is about gender. We add the Q, and that can be about either. If we add in the I, which is for intersex, that's about sex assignment. And we don't explain that to people. So people don't know that you can be gay and trans. You can be non-binary and a lesbian. People don't get that. So I wrote a book to say, here, I know this is confusing. Read this. It'll help. And it's really meant to be just a kind of how-to guide for people to get the fundamentals of this conversation, to understand the language, to understand what safe space is about, what allyship is about, and how to create inclusive spaces for LGBTQIA plus folks. Do we need it? That is a little more nuanced. So I'll give you an example of why we need it. In this year alone, or in 2023, it's June, over 500 pieces of anti-LGBTQI plus legislation have either been tabled or passed in the United States. over 500. We're halfway through the year. Most of them are anti-trans legislations. Many of them have actually been overturned by the courts already. But the reality is that we are in a bit of a swing back of the pendulum. We got really far forward with marriage equality, with things like the elimination of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with trans people in the military, and now the pendulum swings back. And we're just seeing an attempt to erode our human rights. We're also seeing companies that are waffling on their support. And I think of 3 examples recently of that. Target, that decided to remove some of their Pride collection from their stores because of pushback they got in their communities. What are they called? Bud Light. Sorry, I was thinking beer. And Bud Light, that got a bunch of pushback when they had a trans influencer do an advertising campaign. And the Los Angeles Dodgers, that were going to be recognizing a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, and they got pushback from some members of the Catholic Church, and they rescinded the offer of recognition. The thing about being an allyship with a community is that you're with us in the good times and the bad. And if your commitment to inclusion is actually solid, if it's not performative, then your response to that pushback needs to be resolute. So in Bud Light's case, instead of pushing back on people and saying, no, we support this person, they fired the head of marketing. In the case of Target, instead of pushing back, they removed items from the Pride collection. In the case of the LA Dodgers, when they got pushback from the community, they actually reinstated the reward. That never should have happened, because they should have said to the Catholic Church, you know what? The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are the group we chose, and they do amazing work, and we support them. That's the thing. Being an allyship means you're with us in good times and in bad. And I would say that now more than ever, we need to be resolute in our focus of working toward inclusion for all people. It's not just about LGBTQIA plus people. It's about all people. And unfortunately, we're seeing, particularly in the US, and I spend, half of my life there, we're seeing a huge pushback against people's civil liberties and their civil rights by a small minority that's just really noisy. And we need to push back on that.
Thank you very much. It's a powerful message. This is Michael Bach. He is the author of Birds of All Feathers, and his new book is Alphabet Soup. If you want to learn about Michael and his work, you can check out his website. It's michaelbach.com. This is Dory Clark, and this is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. Michael, it's such a pleasure to have you here and to share your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dory, for having me. It's great to see you, and it's great to be here.
Thank you all, and see you next week.